Now on Beliefs, a fascinating guy who argues you can be a Buddhist atheist. He had a shaved head and wore a robe every day. He studied with the Dalai Lama. Then he had a crisis of faith. He has a remarkable backstory and a remarkable philosophy. You at one point in your life had a shaved head and wore a robe. How did you get to be a Buddhist monk?
Well, I grew up in England, in north of London, and I was part of the hippie generation, basically. I was probably a typically alienated, confused, directionless young man. In any case, I earned enough money to be able to afford to flee the British Isles, which I saw as the primary source of my discontent. But inevitably, at that time, I gravitated eastwards onto the hippie trail that led from Istanbul through Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then the Holy Grail, India. So I arrived in India in September of 1972, and having crossed the border in Amritsar, I went straight up to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama was already living at that time, and within a few days enrolled in a course on Buddhism in Dharamsala, and began a process of study that has quite literally not stopped since then, to such a point that I realized that if I really wanted to go into depth in these studies, in these practices, the best way to do that would be to take monastic vows, which would narrow my interests to Buddhism alone. And I remained a monk within the Tibetan tradition for another 5 or 6 years, both in India and then subsequently in Switzerland. And I had all sorts of difficulties with Tibetan Buddhist orthodoxy, which led to a kind of inner crisis where I really had to choose between pursuing my Tibetan studies or going into a tradition that laid more emphasis on just formal meditation practice. That's what I felt I was missing.
What was the source of your crisis?
The source of my crisis was that I could not accept some of the primary doctrines that underpinned the edifice of Tibetan Buddhist belief, or even Buddhist belief in some respects, particularly the doctrine of reincarnation. I could not believe, I found it very hard to accept. So I found myself as a Tibetan Buddhist monk, to all extents and purposes, a person who believed and physically manifested a commitment to that tradition, and yet I did not, in my heart of hearts, believe some of the primary doctrines. So that was a struggle.
I would imagine a real struggle. You getting up every morning and saying these elaborate prayers, and you don't believe them.
Essentially, yes. There were other aspects also of Tibetan Buddhism, the whole business with the prayers and the deities and the tantric practices. That didn't fit with my temperament at all. So in my crisis with Tibetan Buddhism, what that led me to was a very almost visceral sense of the question of life itself. You know, what is this existence? What is this existence? Who am I? What is human life about? And these were becoming questions that I could feel almost in my body. They weren't just intellectual curiosities. They were urgent questions that life itself was posing to me.
When you realized that you didn't really buy it, how much internal discomfort did that create for you?
I used to wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, agonizing over points of Buddhist doctrine. It was that bad, because to not be a hypocrite, to be truthful about who I was as a monk in that tradition, I felt that I had to embrace the totality of its doctrines. It's a bit like a Christian monk who suddenly starts thinking, well, maybe there isn't a God. Now that would be a problem.
Your doubts about Tibetan Buddhist dogma were viewed as, you use the term, thought crimes, on a level, right?
That's right, yeah.
On a level with, you know, murder or robbery or something like that.
Yeah, what the Buddhists call wrong view.
Wrong view, right.
Wrong view is bad news.
So what then, to your mind, does it mean to be a Buddhist without beliefs? And is that controversial in the world of Buddhism?
My Buddhism is an entirely natural one. I'm I'm a naturalist, I'm probably a materialist at some level, that I feel that this world, this experience that is mediated through this body and this brain, that is all there is. I don't feel any need, and I see no evidence for appealing to a higher reality or some absolute truth that transcends that. It's all very well to meditate for 20 minutes a day, but if the rest of your life is a mess, then what value does the meditation have?
Some, but not that much.
Some, but not that much. So my aspiration would be to make all of my activities as a person, my inner life, my psychological life, my social interactions, my work, all of that integral to what I would call the Dhamma, or the path, rather than privileging one aspect, meditation.
Thanks to Stephen Batchelor and again to Wafa Sultan, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Belief.